Welcome back to episode 20 of the Two Thinking Apes podcast. Tonight we're here with Sam Roggeveen. So Sam is the director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program and a visiting fellow at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU. So before joining the Lowy Institute, Sam was a senior strategic analyst in the Office of National Assessments, where his work dealt mainly with North Asian strategic affairs, including nuclear strategy and Asian military forces. Sam also worked in arms control policy in Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and as an analyst in the Defence Intelligence Organisation. Sam has a long-standing interest in politics and political philosophy, and in 2019 he wrote Our Very Own Brexit, Australia's Hollow Politics and Where It Could Lead Us, about the hollowing out of Western democracy and its implications for Australia. Welcome to the podcast, Sam. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thanks both. I should update my bio on the website, by the way. That visiting fellowship with the ANU has expired, actually.
Oh, okay. When was that?
Well, I don't know when exactly it finished, but I only learnt about it a couple of weeks ago. So.
Oh, okay. To kickstart it off, I probably want to ask, what made you get into this space you're in? Like, what did you study if you went to uni, and like, what was your first job out of uni? That kind of whole situation.
Especially the focus on the Asian side, like the Asian countries, because it's pretty specialized. You don't really see many people focusing on a certain area. Well, I don't, as just like normal uneducated person in terms of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I mean, I guess it goes back to high school to begin with, where I guess like a lot of kids my age and my generation who saw Top Gun, I wanted to be a fighter pilot.
Yeah.
And I started getting interested in military things, and it kind of grew from there. And in sort of years 11 and 12, I became more and more interested in politics and international relations and the military and strategic dimensions of international relations. So that took me to Deakin University, because that was the only university that was offering strategic studies at an undergraduate level. Everywhere else you had to, do an arts degree first, but I wanted to do strategic studies straight away. So I did that. I went to Deakin in Geelong. I went and I did strategic studies there, but also, politics and philosophy. Got really interested in philosophy. Did an honours degree there where I, wrote a short thesis, and then I kind of drifted a little bit for a while, actually, just doing tutoring at university, until finally I decided to get into a research degree, which started as a master's, and which I had every intention of converting to a PhD. And that was about political philosophy. So that became really a much bigger interest. And then as I approached the end of that master's thesis, I saw an ad in the paper to go and work in the Defence Intelligence Organisation in Canberra, which is, the intelligence assessment agency inside the Defence Department. And kind of on a whim, I applied, and they offered me a job. That was in 1999. They offered me a job, and so at the time, the salary of at a fairly low level in the Defence Department looked much better than a scholarship and finishing a PhD. So I just decided to start working. I wasn't that committed to a kind of intellectual life anyway, because I didn't really want to be a university lecturer, and I didn't want to do research for a living. And so I went to work in the Defence Intelligence Organisation, and I was there for 4 years in the end. I started in 99, and I worked there until just after the so-called major combat operations finished in Iraq. And I served there as a kind of low to mid-ranking intelligence analyst, where you get access to incredible sources of information from not only from our intelligence sources but from our allies as well. And you write analysis. Sometimes you do really short-term stuff. Other times you get weeks or months to work on a particular topic. And during a crisis like the Iraq War, the great thing about the Defence Department is that first of all, you can you can advance fairly quickly. So you can, because it's a big department, you can get promoted very fast. And the other great thing about it is that at fairly junior levels, you'll get access to senior people. So I was, in my mid-20s at the time, and I was briefing every once in a while, not often, but every once in a while, I would brief the Chief of Defence Force and the other, chiefs of the Army, Air Force, and Navy. Every Tuesday or Wednesday, they would sit around and get briefings from DIO staff on hot issues. So those were pretty sort of heady days. And that was an incredible thing to be part of. I was there when 9/11 happened. I was there when the Iraq War began. I was there when the Bali bombing happened. So those were sort of tumultuous times. And then I spent 2 years in the Department of Foreign Affairs, which I didn't enjoy as much. And then after 2 years, left to go back into the intelligence world because I really wanted to do intelligence assessment, which took me to ONA, which now called ONI. But at the time, it was called the Office of National Assessments, and there's the senior kind of intelligence assessment agency in the Australian system. And then after 2 years there, where I was very, very happy, I got a better offer from the Lowy Institute. And I've been there 14 years now. So I'll stop there, but we can go into some of that in more detail if you like.
Yeah. Can I ask, I don't know what you can touch on. I'm assuming you've signed NDAs and whatnot in the Iraq War and confidential information. Is there anything you can touch on within that, like in terms of what allies information you received and things like that? Because I'm assuming most of the public doesn't really have any sort of a sense into that window of the world, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can tell you things that basically are public, which is that, first of all, Australia is a member of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement. So there are 5 partners that have, I think, unarguably the closest intelligence sharing relationship of any 5 countries in the world. And we don't see everything that all those allies produce, but we do see a lot. And so that leads to a very sort of, collaborative working environment, lots of conferences, but where analysts get together and discuss problems and compare notes on their views. And a lot of cross-pollination of ideas. And of course, Australia contributes to that as well by, we have our own intelligence collection agencies, and they too make their intelligence available to the other Five Eyes partners. So that's Australia, the United States, Canada, the UK, and New Zealand are the Five Eyes. I guess the sobering thing about it all is that no matter how good that system is, it failed miserably in the Iraq War. I mean, we all failed, and that's probably, when I look back on it, the Iraq War, I still think is the kind of the defining event in terms of shaping my own thinking and my own sort of intellectual development. The fact that so many good, smart people still got it completely wrong, and not just the intelligence world, but in the policy world as well, particularly in the United States. Where they made a disastrous choice. And at the time, I thought it was the right, we were doing the right thing. I wasn't a sort of full-throated advocate for it, but I thought on balance, the Iraq War was a good idea and was the right thing to do. And it's clear to me in retrospect that was an incredibly naive judgment. But like I say, that's become kind of a formative experience for me.
In comparing like Afghanistan and the US pulling out, are there any comparators in that sense?
You mean comparisons between Iraq and Afghanistan?
Yeah.
I think, but both. It took far too long in both cases for the United States to realise its mistake and to adjust. And that kind of is a, is a window into a kind of a mental trap that we all have at one time or another, which is the sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
Because we're already in there, because we've already invested so much, therefore we need to keep going. But of course, that never makes sense. You may have invested a lot, but those costs are already gone. You've already paid that price. And so it's not a reason to dive in even deeper. I guess another way to put it is, if you're in a hole, stop digging. And it took the Americans and us a long time to stop digging.
Yeah. Okay.
What made you travel into the intelligence side of the military or the army instead of boots on the ground type thing? Was it a choice at all for you?
Well, as I said, when I began in high school, I wanted to join the Air Force and be a fighter pilot. But actually, it was kind of a slightly sad story at the time, because I remember very vividly living in Melbourne and making a special trip into the city to go to the recruitment office. And they sat me down there and said, fine, if you want to be a fighter pilot, take an eye test. And I failed the eye test.
So
yeah, I failed the eye test. And then the reason it's so sort of peculiar in retrospect is that they made no attempt to keep me there and say, look, there are thousands of other great jobs you can do in the Navy or the Air Force or the Army. They just said sorry, and they showed me the door. And at that point I thought, okay, well, I'd better try something else. And luckily my interests were broad enough that I could find something else that I wanted to do in that field. And when I look back on it, I doubt that being a fighter pilot, once the excitement of it wore off, I doubt it would have been a very satisfying career intellectually for me. Not to say that the Air Force wouldn't offer, other opportunities. I'm sure it would have. And I think that is the great thing about the military and as I said, the defense world generally, whether you're civilian or military, that's big enough that if you're talented, they'll notice and you'll advance quickly. But yeah, as it was, I was just shown the door. And then at that point, I just thought, well, okay, I've got to try something else.
Can I ask, how did your area of expertise within the Lowy Institute go to China and at the Asian area? And I want to ask you a lot of questions about that. But first, I want to know how you kind of ended up in that area. Yeah. Was that just interest?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think simply because it's so central to Australia. So really, my first interest is in Australian foreign policy, Australian defence and strategic policy, and because China has become so central, and I think probably also it was partly the fact that I continue to have an interest in military affairs specifically and in military technology. And it's just become such an incredibly fertile area over the last 20 years. Like when I was much younger and when I was first developing this interest, of course, that was still in the Cold War days. And occasionally in books and magazines, you'd see new, blurry photos of the latest Soviet fighter jet, for instance, or the new aircraft carrier they were building. And then the Soviet Union collapsed and the Soviet military collapsed alongside of it. And that's just stopped. They stopped developing and they're only just really rebuilding over the last decade or so. But in China, in the last 2 decades, that whole phenomenon has become so fascinating. And the pace of change so rapid that has really taken my interest. I should stress, I try not to be... although I do continue to have an interest in this stuff, I try not to be a kind of, a military fetishist. There are too many people in this field who do, I think, have that, a sort of boy's own fascination with the weapons. I try to keep my feet on the ground and remember what these things are for and just how destructive they are. And I'm always, in the stuff I write, particularly on strategic affairs and in international relations, I do always keep in mind the importance of peace. And in fact, now that China is so big and that the risks of war between the United States and China are growing, I think one of my jobs as an analyst in this area is to, just warn people who have forgotten about the risk of war between major powers, just how incredibly destructive it can be.
Do you think should we be worried about the rise of China? And do you think the West is kind of in a decline right now? Or is this because obviously, as representing the public, for us, we see a lot of headlines. There's kind of that, for me, there's that kind of that general tone felt. And especially where we're geographically located, should we be worried?
Well, I think you should be less worried than the headlines suggest.
Yeah, of course.
So there's a natural inclination in the media to focus on the negative and to sensationalize and to dramatize. So certainly the chance of conflict between the United States, its allies on the one hand, and China on the other hand has grown, but it's growing off a very low base. And there's still excellent reasons for all sides to remain calm and to not escalate. There's always a risk of war starting by accident. That's certainly happened before in history, so it can happen again when two sides sort of rub up against each other and then, they meet when they didn't mean to meet.
Yeah.
Accidents happen and then things escalate from there. Even though nobody really intended to start a war, they can start anyway. So I'd say the risk of conflict is escalating off a low base, but it's still much lower than the headlines suggest. And for Australia specifically, I mean, we're still a long way away. So from the most northern point of Australia to the most southerly point of China is still around 4,000 kilometres. The chances of us getting caught up in a war with China are probably more likely if we're fighting alongside the United States, far away from Australia, in Taiwan, for instance, or in the South China Sea. But it won't be a fight about Australian territory. That's extremely unlikely.
Do you think Australia... Go.
No, I was going to say, from
no,
me,
no, go.
I was like to say, like, I see on the news, from what I understand, China has a heavy... our relationship with China is extremely important for them with our resources and minerals and all that. And then the US and China also have a very important relationship because the US imports a lot of things from China and so forth. So I think it'd be in everyone's best interest to remain at peace, which is why personally I'm not really too worried at all.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's just me being naive or...
No, it's not naive. I think that's realistic. And, the one big difference between the situation between China and the US today and the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union is that the two economies are so interlinked in this case, which they weren't before. The Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc was basically, hermetically sealed. There was barely any economic relationship between East and West. That's not the case today. So both sides have a huge, overwhelming interest in making sure that globalized economic system is maintained and isn't disturbed by war. I guess one thing to watch out for in that sense is what economists are referring to as decoupling, which is this idea that both the US and China are sort of inching away from this globalization model and trying to bring, key parts of their economy back on shore. The evidence that that's actually happening is still a bit thin. And in fact, even in the current environment of tension between the United States and China, I think in the last financial year, trade flows actually increased. And they certainly increased between China and Australia as well, despite China's trade measures. So it's very difficult to decouple these two economies. But if they do manage to actually pull these two economies apart, then you'd have to say that suddenly you've created a situation in which the risks of going to war are a little bit lower than they used to be. The economic costs of fighting would be slightly lower than they were if the two economies were more intertwined.
Is it feasible for Australia to find somewhere to sell the stuff, like if we decouple from the Chinese economy, in terms of iron ore and things like that, like a demand that large?
I'm not an economist, but I think almost certainly no, certainly not for the iron ore. There just isn't a customer out there that's as lucrative and as big as China. Now, it's easy to say from that, by the way, to conclude from that we're in a situation of dependency, but it's actually more like codependency, because the Chinese need us as well. There is no other source of iron ore that's as reliable or as high quality as Australia. So it's a situation of mutual dependency. But look, on the broader question of decoupling for Australia, if it was easy, if it was possible, it would have happened already. The market would have taken care of it. That's my view. The fact that it hasn't happened, the fact that China is still the market of choice for so many, is an indication to me that the alternative markets are just not that easy to find, and actually would be very expensive to find. And if companies had to find them, they would need government assistance to do so, maybe a lot. And in the end, that means, the Australian people, the Australian taxpayers, are the ones who suffer from that kind of decoupling.
Can I ask, the Chinese tariffs on, I think it's barley, wine, beef, things like that.
Yeah, there are a few other categories, but those are the main ones, yeah.
Wouldn't that suggest we're more dependent, or are they punishing themselves in the process?
They're absolutely punishing themselves. I mean, they are punishing us as well. So it hasn't been without cost to Australia, but it's actually been pretty minor. The Lowy Institute did its own analysis on this earlier in the year, and we found that most of the companies that were affected by these tariffs and other trade measures have found new markets for their goods. So we've come out of it pretty well, and that shows the advantage of having a very resilient modern economy. But in the end, it's the Chinese consumer that suffers, because Chinese consumers they don't have access to the same products they used to. So either they go without those products, or they have to find alternatives somewhere else, where they'll either be more expensive or lower quality, or both. So tariffs, this is something that Trump never understood, but it's a basic sort of tenet of economics. Tariffs are self-harming. And so it's the Chinese consumer that suffers in the end.
Was that provoked by, I forgot the timeline of it, Australia joining that trilateral agreement with the nuclear subs?
No, this
was way before
that,
wasn't that?
Predates it, yeah.
Was there a specific incident that caused all the tariffs, or was it just the general rising of tensions and Australia kind of betting on the US with the agreement?
Yeah, it was a general rising of tensions that followed a period, followed a period of Chinese actions and provocations, and then Australian counteractions. So what China objected to was the fact that we introduced foreign interference legislation, for instance. And we stopped Huawei from bidding on our 5G infrastructure contract. And also, what really pissed them off was that we suggested that there be an inquiry into the origins of the COVID virus. Now, all of those things, China had a big hand in provoking those actions by Australia. But those kind of things culminated in China, imposing various tariffs and other trade measures, which are still in place and probably will be for several years. That China has been in these kind of disputes with other countries, South Korea, I think it was Denmark, although I always it may have been Norway, and it took a good 5-6 years for the situation to be normalised, and in fact, it may never, return entirely to the pre-crisis normal.
Wow, it's interesting. It's like bully tactics, or is it just me reading too many headlines?
No, it's bullying. Certainly, it is bullying. Absolutely, but a lot of countries use trade measures that way, and the encouraging thing including the United States, of course, they place sanctions on other countries all the time. Doing it right now to North Korea and to Iran and others.
Yeah, true.
The encouraging thing for Australia, though, is that we can say pretty definitively that it hasn't worked so far. Australia has stood pretty firm, and we haven't been, provocative. I think in our, there was the government had a choice, for instance, to place retaliatory trade measures on China, but we haven't done that. And I think that's incredibly smart. That was the right thing to do. Our aim should never be to escalate these disputes, but we should put in place a sort of, we should have an economy that's built to withstand this pressure. I think the term that the government really likes, and which I also like, is resilience. And resilience means an ability to bounce back when you've been hit and to get back to normal as quickly as possible. And we're showing we have a resilient economy.
What do you think about Australia's purchase of the nuclear subs? Do you think couldn't that be argued as provocation in a sense?
Yes.
Or?
Yes. So, I mean, I have argued this myself in newspaper opinion pieces, that the kind of economic response we've shown to China's provocation has been exactly right. And it's odd that that kind of approach hasn't transferred to the military side, because, yeah, I do think it's unnecessarily provocative. I have written that it's the wrong approach, that these submarines are the wrong weapon system for our defence, and that they send the wrong signal about our trust long term, our faith in the American alliance. So yeah, I've got some real reservations about that.
Do you think we are putting too much trust in the American alliance, and we should kind of play more of a, not neutral, but take a step back from that kind of issue between China and America? Like, what would you think the best approach would be in that very sense?
Well, I'd say there are two long-term risks with regard to our alliance with the United States. So it's not clear yet that America has really made a choice what it wants to do about China at the uppermost level, the uppermost political level. Are they prepared for China to be to basically share power with China in Asia? Because China's now, as you know, almost as big an economy as America.
Yeah.
And no country of that size is going to say that it is prepared to be strategically subordinate to another power.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not realistic. I mean, Japan sort of did that after World War II, but that's a special case. Great powers always want to have the kind of military and strategic influence, particularly in their own backyard, that their economic status demands. And so China wants to be top dog. Yeah. America doesn't want to let it. So the question is, with China rising faster than America can keep up, is America prepared to give China a place in the sun, if you like? Or is the United States going to try and keep China down? If the Americans take the decision to try to keep China down, then I think there's a much higher risk of war between the two of them. And so when we put ourselves out there as being, all in with the United States, we're risking that we get taken along for that ride. If, on the other hand, the United States makes the other decision and says, no, China's too big, this is too hard, and it's not worth it, we're pulling back, then equally, we're in a really vulnerable position. We've tied our lot in with the United States, and yet the United States has decided that it's not in this fight in the way we would like them to be. So therefore, I think the more sensible approach is to not abandon the alliance. We don't need to do anything precipitate. But the approach is to, within the structure of the alliance, to build as much as we can independent capabilities. And that includes the ability to be able to defend ourselves without American help if we have to.
This may be me fear-mongering, but in terms of, isn't there a bit of a difference between America as a superpower and China as a superpower, in the sense of America has democracy, freedom of press, et cetera, et cetera? I'm sure they do terrible things as well, but the Chinese Communist Party as it is right now doesn't really have all those things. So is there a moral or an ethical argument to not allow that influence to spread, would you say?
Yes, I would say there is that is a legitimate moral argument, but it has to be weighed against another moral argument, which is the scourge of war. So how do you balance the risk of an erosion of liberal and democratic norms and principles? How do you balance that against the risk that you might be actually provoking war with China? The other thing you need to, I think that we need to all keep in mind, and when we make these calculations, is to ask ourselves, how much of a risk is China really to our democratic freedoms? It's pretty clear that China certainly doesn't want to be infected with Western ideas. They're very, very sensitive about that. And they want the Communist Party to maintain, unchallenged authority over all of China. But what's less clear is how much China wants to export its own ideology to us. And in fact, I would argue that they don't really have much of an appetite for that. So then the question becomes, well, as long as we're not trying to export our ideology on China, why should we worry about China exporting its ideology onto us? Surely our own democratic values and principles and institutions are pretty safe.
Yeah.
And on balance, I lean more towards that view, which isn't to say that China can't, influence. I mean, we're already in a situation we've seen over the last few years where China has, they've been hacking attacks on the parliament, for instance. They've tried to interfere with election processes in various countries. So has Russia. So there is a case to be made that our values are and our democratic institutions are at risk, but I don't think that risk is existential. I think it's something we can cope with pretty well.
Do you think we have like an obligation in the sense of, from my understanding, like Taiwan, there's a threat of invasion or war. Hong Kong, it was in the news a lot before COVID, and now that's kind of gone quiet. I'm not really sure what's happening at the moment. Hopefully you can enlighten me. And Tibet was acquired. I'm not sure the right term for that. And also when there are conflicts on the Indian-Chinese border, things like that.
Yep.
So couldn't there be that argument that there's that expansionism?
There has certainly been territorial expansionism in the South China Sea.
I was about to say that.
Where they built artificial islands and seas that are by international law regarded as not being Chinese have been claimed by China. China's not sort of that's sort of exceptional in the sense that China does play very hardball when it comes to territories that it claims are its own in historical terms. But when it comes to other territories, it's not traditionally been a sort of expansionist power in that old-fashioned sense.
Compared to America, which seems to be.
Well, I mean, America. That's a
no. I don't know. I just want to know.
Those are deep waters as well. I mean, territorial expansionism has sort of gone out of fashion a little bit because, as is often said, if it's resources you're after, it's cheaper to buy them than to invade a country.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Look, do we have an obligation? I think is what you were asking to say. In the case of Hong Kong, look, it's probably already too late. Hong Kong has been now more or less fully incorporated, or largely incorporated anyway, into Chinese governance structures to the point where, the kind of liberal freedoms that it enjoyed even up until a couple of years ago are disappearing fast. Taiwan is in a different situation, and war is a possibility, but again, not terribly likely. So again, the same question applies. Yes, those values are important to us, and helping other democracies is important to us as well. But how important? Are we willing to risk potentially a nuclear war for that kind of thing? And in any case, how much difference could Australia make anyway? We have, a modestly sized defence force, which is designed largely to defend the Australian continent, not to,
go somewhere else.
Yeah. Although we do a lot of that, and the submarine decision is an indicator that we're planning to do more of it, alongside the Americans. But in a Taiwan scenario, if it happened tomorrow, there's really not that much Australia could do.
I also read somewhere that China had 200 to 300 nukes, and America had 5,500 or something like that.
Roughly right.
So
that's roughly right.
Yeah. Like it'd just be a disaster on every level for like China and the world. But surely with numbers like that, you couldn't consider China on the same level with the US at the moment, purely based.
No, not with nuclear weapons. Certainly, there's an argument that it doesn't matter very much. I mean, but once you
But
get
you just need one.
well, you probably need more than one. But yeah, what it kind of exposes is what you might call the balance of resolve. You know, we strategists often talk about the balance of forces, which crudely put means, you know, China has this many tanks and missiles, America has that many tanks and missiles. So that matters. But the balance of resolve also matters, which is to say, how much do you want it? How badly do you want this, and how much risk are you prepared to take? How many losses are you prepared to suffer? So when it comes to Taiwan, for instance, and the possibility that it might escalate to a nuclear war, does it matter that China could only potentially bomb, 5 American cities with its warheads, and that America could bomb 500 of China's cities? That may not matter, because 5 might be enough. That's a lot. Five major US cities is more destructive power than has ever been used against the United States in its history. Yeah. So the question the Americans would be asking themselves is, well, we like Taiwan, and Taiwan's a democracy, and we want to support it, but do we like it that much? Is it that important?
Yeah.
And the answer almost certainly is no, it's not. It's not important enough to take that kind of risk.
I watched a 60 Minutes episode on the likelihood of war with China, and I forgot the exact stat, but it said Taiwan produced some chip which was like 80 or 70% of the world's chip, which was needed for some sort of military thing. Do you know what that is? Could you touch on that?
I don't know the details, but I do know that Taiwan is absolutely critical in the microprocessor industry. So I feel like I'm already at the very edge of my understanding, even saying that. So I won't go much further. But okay. It is a critical node in the modern economy. Running everything from. I mean, I think actually we're thinking about buying a new car at the moment, and I'm reading all about these delays in new car deliveries, not just in Australia but all around the world, and it's because of the shortage of microchips.
Really?
So it's a critical industry for the entire modern economy, and Taiwan is critical to it. Yeah.
Interesting. In terms of, I think Costin said it before. I wanted to ask, do you think there's realistically a tipping point where China's military might overcomes America's? Didn't they test a hypersonic missile or something along that?
Yeah, hypersonic missile.
Sorry, you broke up there.
You broke out, Costin.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, with the military might, I'm pretty sure they already have, they've got 2 million odd soldiers in their army, and America has 1.2 or 1.3. Yeah. And then, the testing of the missiles. I don't know if that's just a warning, or if they're retaliating and showing what they can do, or I don't know. But,
so the first thing to say is that the numbers of soldiers don't matter all that much. In fact, a good kind of rule of thumb for showing how quickly China's military is modernizing is to look at how that number is reducing, because it used to be much larger. It used to be a very sort of industrial age military where you just, pour soldiers onto the battlefield. That's really not what the Chinese military is about anymore. And so you'll see the size of the army actually reduce over time, and that probably means that its capabilities are improving because it's less industrial age and more information age. But with that said, the Chinese Navy, in just the sheer number of ships in the Navy, is already larger than the US Navy. It's far less capable still, but just in sheer numerical terms, it's already larger. But again, I'd go back to my earlier point about the balance of resolve. China's military doesn't have to be a lot bigger than America's for the balance of resolve to move. All that matters is that China is big enough and bad enough that it can cause unacceptable levels of damage to the United States. So, for instance, let's not even talk about nuclear weapons. Let's talk about if China invades Taiwan and the Americans decide, well, should we move in here and protect Taiwan from the invasion, they now have to think in terms of, well, we'll probably lose 2 aircraft carriers, and our bases in Japan and in Guam will get bombed. And then again, the Americans ask themselves, well, we're now in the biggest war since Vietnam, and potentially in the biggest war since Korea, or even World War II. Is Taiwan important enough for that? And, so that those calculations start to change, even long before China is more powerful than America. I guess the other thing to keep in mind is that America's got global commitments. Europe, the Middle East, as well as Asia. China at the moment really doesn't. So its military can be concentrated on one Asia-Pacific theatre. America's forces are spread all around the world.
Does UK, are they important in the conversation, or are they just a supporting ally?
I don't think they're important, no.
Yeah, so it's really just America.
Some people, no, that's not, I wouldn't go that far. So there are really critical regional powers in Asia. The biggest ones are, of course, India and Japan, Russia as well. South Korea is, I think, the 7th largest economy in the world. Okay. So these are all important powers in their own right, and they all exercise a kind of a certain level of restraint on China's actions, which is really important, and will become more and more important, I think, over the years as America's resolve starts to decline. But the UK, no, I don't think that's a strategically significant power in Asia. It has a relatively small military, much smaller, of course, than in its pomp, and its ability to deploy halfway around the world is pretty limited. It recently deployed an aircraft carrier battle group to Asia, but that's a very rare thing for the United Kingdom. And so I don't take the UK seriously as a major strategic player in Asia.
I forgot to ask as well on the nuclear sub-purchase. How significant is our relationship with France damaged, and is that important really?
I actually think that will pass.
Okay.
Again, it's the headlines probably elevate it too much, and Macron today making some really some really blunt statements about having been lied to by Australia. So it's a terrible look, but honestly, these things will pass, and it's sort of unfashionable to say it, but Barnaby Joyce has a point. We didn't break the rules. We played by the rules. I mean, the contract has had escape clauses in it. Yeah. It was open to both sides of the agreement to cancel the agreement. We cancelled the agreement. Okay. I mean, the way we did it, I guess, is questionable, but
no notice or something. Was that right?
That's still open to debate, and it's. Okay. I think what the French are saying is that actually Australia actively deceived France. Mm-hmm. So we actually went out of our way to muddy the waters with the French. I think Australia denies that. The truth probably lies somewhere in between.
Yeah.
But this too shall pass.
Okay. Interesting. Did you want to touch a bit about your book? I was interested about that. What motivated you to write that?
Yeah, I guess, look, this is my other... what I tried to do is bring my two interests together. My interest in politics together with my interest in international affairs and, Australia's place in the world. And really the premise of the thing was that it's possible for one to have massive effects on the other, because the biggest change to England's standing in the world as a player in international affairs, the biggest thing that happened to them since the Suez Crisis was Brexit, right, which completely overturned their relationship with Europe. And yet Brexit in and of itself had nothing to do with foreign policy. It was a completely domestic drama in the United Kingdom. So here's this, basically what was a dispute within one political party inside the United Kingdom turned into a referendum, and then overnight overturned Britain's relationship with Europe. So domestic political dramas can have these outsized effects on your place in the world.
Yeah.
And my argument was that can happen to Australia too.
In what sense?
Well, so the starting point was to say that what brought about Brexit is a broader phenomenon that actually is evident in all Western democracies and in Australia as well. And that is that politics has become basically hollow. It's dominated by two political, by big centre-right and centre-left political parties, which have all, to varying degrees, lost touch with the public. So these political parties have their origins as mass movements. Labor parties are the great example. So, there are Labor parties in most Western democracies, go by various names. And they all start in the union movement. Yeah. Of course, there is no union movement, or virtually, I'm exaggerating, but the influence of the union movement in Australia and in every Western democracy is kind of a shadow of its former self. And yet these Labor parties continue to exist, and not only exist, they are major forces in Western politics. And that goes for all big centre-right and centre-left political parties. So what's happened, I think, over the last 40 or 50 years is that these parties have lost touch with the public, their membership has declined, their vote share has declined, and yet they engineer different ways to basically keep themselves at the centre of politics. And they become quite small and they become highly professionalised. So you don't see politicians coming from the grassroots anymore. Basically, politicians are trained. It's kind of a finishing school. You start at university, you go and work as a staffer.
Yeah.
You work you work in a branch. You get pre-selected, and then you join the parliament. Right. About half of our MPs now in the Australian Parliament take that sort of path. And so politics becomes very isolated, very insular, and it loses touch with the public. And what's happened, I think, in all Western democracies is that we've reached the point where the public has had kind of a gutful of that, and they find ways to communicate their dissatisfaction. And that's what Brexit was.
Do you think Sorry, okay. Do you think Brexit was overall a good thing for England? Or is that too simplified?
No, it's not. But I honestly don't. I think probably not. But I think it was a welcome correction to British politics, which had become really detached from the public. I mean, still is in many ways. The trend hasn't really slowed down too much. But that and Trump, to me,
I was going to say that next.
Right, were both warnings that the public had kind of a gutful. And in Western Europe, it happened slightly differently. So in Western Europe, again, you had these big political parties, and they all, in different ways, went into decline. And you had populist parties on the right starting to become more popular. The Greens also became much more popular. Non-traditional parties started to rise up and basically disturb this very comfortable status quo that, where you have two big centre-right and centre-left parties at the centre of the system. And it all started to sort of give way. And I thought, well, there's something going on here. And I think it's been misdiagnosed as the rise of populism. I don't think that's what's happened. Populism is, roughly as popular or unpopular as it's always been. There's always been that tendency in society. But what's happened is that the big parties are all in decline.
Including in Australia?
I think all over the Western world, in every Western democracy. But here you see it in Australia as well. I mean, both of our major parties, the primary vote, when you vote, you can order. Yeah. In the lower house, you can put preferences down. The number of people who put the major parties down as number one has been in decline for over 30 years now. Wow. And we're almost at a point now where we have a three-way split. Labor, the coalition, and then all the independents and small parties. It's about, it's not this exactly, but we're getting to the point where it's 30-30-30 for, or 33-33-33 for all, for those three blocks, voting blocks. So that means, in future, we're going to see a lot more hung parliaments or very, very small majorities in the lower house, and minority governments like the Gillard government, which not the end of the world. I mean, a lot of countries have that situation already, and we'll cope. But it's very new for Australia.
That seems like an overall benefit, just hearing it from your explanation, because it seems like more competition, I feel like, is always better. But would you argue that that's a benefit for Australia in particular?
Yeah, I would actually. In other systems have coped less well with this drift away from the major parties, and we've seen the election of there was essentially a far right party. I mean, this is rarely sort of talked about in Australia, but a far right party, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, became the opposition, the official opposition. This was a party that didn't even exist when Angela Merkel became Chancellor. And by the end of her time in office, it became, the official opposition. It's since drifted a little bit. In Australia, we've coped better with this shift, and the major parties are still very much in control. I guess the danger in Australia is that we haven't yet had a really talented, charismatic politician from outside the major parties. If that ever happens, and it doesn't have to be a far right or a far left figure. I mean, in France, for instance, Macron was a centrist. And he's a very traditional sort of centre-right figure, but he doesn't belong to either of the major parties in France. And so that could happen in Australia as well. If someone has the resources and the kind of charisma and the talent, then I think, that they do have the potential to really shake up the political system. It hasn't happened yet.
I remember a few years ago in Greece, the Golden Dawn.
You go. I've talked enough.
Well, I remember, I've got a Greek background, and I remember a few years ago, even now, so the Golden Dawn Party, the neo-Nazis, they got really close, extremely close, and it was almost worryingly close back then. So I guess it is a sort of, everyone's getting fed up. I'm personally of the opinion that the Liberal and Labor Party in Australia are very similar, but there's clear differences, but they're not, like, they're centre left and centre right, but they're about like that far off the right and that far off the left. So it's not really like what's the point type thing, which is why last election I voted for neither of them as my top preferences, but that's how I see it. I'm sure many young people see it like that as well. And like, why should we care? No matter who comes in, it's going to be the same, like pretty much the same for us. Like, and
what about your parents? Did your parents, if you don't mind me asking, did your parents feel an affinity, or were they ever members of one political party or the other?
My dad has a strong affinity to the Labor Party, and my mum doesn't really mind. She's been voting Greens recently because she doesn't, like what I just said, she's very similar to me. She doesn't see the point of voting like the Labor and Liberal Party anymore, because they're almost the same thing at this point in terms of most of their policies.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to generalize too much from your situation, knowing so little about it, but it sounds like a pretty typical story to me. Like over generations, the affinity with these major parties has eroded, and this drift occurs away from them, but because they've found ways to kind of maintain their place at the centre of our democracy, most importantly through the voting system, which in the lower house favours the two major parties, because they've managed to do that. It's there's no sign at the moment of that dissatisfaction. You see it at election time, but outside of that, the major parties are still in control. I do think though that we might reach a tipping point where instead of 4 or 5 independents, we get 8 or 10 or 11, and at that point, it's a whole different political system. Governments are almost permanently in minority, and they have to constantly negotiate with small parties and independents.
Would that mean nothing gets done?
Say again.
Would that mean very little would get done because of
Well,
all the different negotiations?
except that's you would think so, except that's not true in other countries. I mean, the Netherlands, I'm Dutch myself, and so I follow Dutch politics well, at a great remove every once in a while. But I know enough to say that in the Netherlands, they've had minority governments. Sometimes it takes them 6 months to actually negotiate the formation of a new government after an election. And yet the country runs very, very well. You couldn't argue, right, that the Netherlands is a well-run place. And I think the similar thing would happen in Australia. In fact, we know that it probably will, because the Gillard government was a minority government and got a lot done. I mean, you might not agree with all of it, but they passed a lot of legislation.
I think a very basic example of everyone being fed up as well. I know in the UK, London mayoral elections, there was I think there was a record number of independents that went up for that. And there was a YouTuber that just jumped on just randomly to become mayor, and he came fifth out of how many, like, over a dozen candidates. And like a YouTuber, he beat a major party. Like Sadiq Khan won, obviously he's part of one of the major parties, but for a YouTuber to come fifth in something that you see as not a joke, like an important part of office, just shows
that scares me.
It's like people have stopped really caring anymore. Like imagine if he won, like
it's like there's a Black Mirror episode on that.
Right. Yeah, I haven't seen that. But so when you started there, you talked about people being fed up, and then at the end you were saying that I can't remember the term you used, but basically I think you said people were disconnected, and I think it's more the latter than the former. People are fed up, but basically I think the more important problem is that they're disconnected, because there's not much evidence that they're really deeply motivated to change the political system. Particularly here in Australia, there aren't, we have our share of demonstrations from time to time, but the country is well run by any standard, by any international standards. Australia is very well run. So the fact that politics feels so distant, and the fact that we're disconnected from our politics, people are prepared to put up with that, I think, on the whole. So to me, the most important trend, and this is around the Western world, not just Australia, is the public disconnection from politics, which, when things are going well, doesn't really need to matter very much. But when they're not, it can have some pretty damaging consequences, including throwing up huge surprises, like your example from London, and also like Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, that YouTuber's whole angle to get to where he got to was the disconnect between politics and young people, and that's what he played on, and that's what got him all the votes. Because he's like his main sayings were all about young people not feeling represented in politics, and the disconnect between young people and the political system, and he came fifth.
Yeah, fascinating.
So it's almost it's a direct correlation, pretty much.
Do you think social media? I have my own little theory. I feel like social media helps with the people getting divided more, because people see their own headlines and they get because you see what you like, so you get your own little bubble. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think the evidence is mixed. I think actually it's possible, but on the other hand, it's easier than ever to read sources that dissent from your own. So in the pre-internet era, you had to work a lot harder to go and buy, media and books and so on, or find voices that clashed with your own. Now it's only a click away. Yeah. So I'm not entirely persuaded that the filter bubble thing, I think it's there. I'm not persuaded it's gotten worse. It's always been there. So, I'm old enough to remember the pre-internet era, and I read right-wing publications, and they overwhelmingly were being read by people who were right-wing. And I also read left-wing publications, and guess what? They're read by people who are left-wing and who want to have their prejudices reinforced, right? It's always more comfortable to hear and to read things that you agree with than things that you don't.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. I think that's a good point to wrap it up. Do you have anything else, Costin, you want to ask?
I'm pretty good.
All right, sweet. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Ferris, for coming on. It's very interesting.
Thank you both. Appreciate your interest.
I didn't think about that I forgot what you said, but how like China needs to make so much of an impact on America for it to matter to America, not just launch 500 nukes. That was a good point. Like I hadn't thought of that. And
That
maybe
scares me, man.
that's
I'm a
my
fearmonger.
ignorance.
I'm far out.
He is a fearmonger.
Don't be too worried. Don't be too worried. I mean, it shouldn't. The kind of where you guys are, the kind of choices you're making about what you're going to do next. I don't think you should let it affect you too much.
No,
Hopefully not.
I don't think it will. Hopefully.
Yeah, I don't think it will, but you never know. But you're right. I wouldn't be up at night for it.
That's right.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.